Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is Jelena, the Gossip Bird, and this is the first episode of Talk Time with Jelena, where anything flows, anything goes. Since this is my first episode, I want you to have a taste of something educational. So, we will have a very special guest today. She is Dr. Amil Josilu B. Olano. She'll tell us about her experiences in teaching English language here in Philippines and abroad. Now, let's find out more. Good morning, ma'am. I'm pleased to have you as my guest here in my podcast today.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for inviting me here today.
Without further ado, ma'am, I will ask you your first question. What are your experiences in teaching English language?
My experiences in teaching the English language, I'd like to say that I've handled different learners from kindergarten to graduate school students. I'd like to think that each experience is unique, fun, and challenging at the same time. I started off as a volunteer teacher for years in the Department of Education before I became a permanent teacher. Then I moved to teach in a higher education institutions because there's two of them. And eventually I became a foreign language teacher in China. It really broadens my perspective because no matter how good of a teacher you are, or how many books you read, or how many strategies you really know, it really boils down to one question. Am I being understood by my students? Or did I really hit my objectives at the end part of it? Now, that's the reason why I always ask my students at the end part of our class, have you learned something today? Now, if the answer is yes, then that makes me happy. If not, then that's a challenge for me to do better next time.
But you know, ma'am, that's what makes you a very good and an effective teacher to the students. Now, let's move on to the second question. How do you feel about it, teaching English language?
How do I feel about it? Well, teaching is always fun for me. I never think of teaching really as a burden. It's more of like a passion. It's more of like, a calling. It can hit you sometimes, especially if you're sick and if you have a lot of things to do. But if you really love what you're doing, everything else is easy. Although I like teaching, smart students, intelligent students, but if I were to choose, I'd probably be choosing students who are quite challenging for me, because having said so, I would be able to see really my accomplishment as a teacher, bringing a student from level 1 to level 5. You know what I mean? It's like the fulfillment of a teacher. Well, because if you have an intelligent student, chances are most of the time you're quite challenged by your students. That's a fact. But if you have students who are like, I don't really like stereotyping students, and I really hate it when I hear the word, lower section. It's like there's a higher section and, the lower section. It doesn't work that way. I've met a lot of students assigned in the quote-unquote lower section, but they're really smart. And these students assigned in those sections, they're very respectful. Well, talking about the language perspective, talking about language teaching though, is quite challenging because you cannot speak English in the entire duration of the class. It's like you're like talking to them in Tagalog, Visayan, and English at the same time, just to make sure that you get your message across. But it boils down again to learning. Were they able to learn about your topic? And I always challenge them to talk in English, no matter how hard it may seem for them, I always try to challenge them to talk. And it's quite fun because, some of their classmates are like teasing them because they're not really used at it. So it's quite fun. Teaching in China is different. The kids aging from 2 to 4 years old, and I'm their first English teacher. To be honest, first teacher. So you can just imagine that. And their English knowledge is sometimes zero. I like it. It's quite challenging, but you can really see the progress. And it makes me happy seeing them talking in English and understanding English. It's quite fun. Teaching in the graduate school is also a different thing. It's like investigating all the theories, pedagogies, and some of the things that they know and they have on the field. Sometimes we have to track back what really happened in there, try to investigate some of the root causes of the problems, for example, in reading, and eventually come up with a solution, a realistic solution for that. And it's funny because when you talk about things like reading problems, or even problems in general in teaching, they always talk about problems in the system, in the government. These things are very inseparable.
Wow. Ma'am, I couldn't fathom how could you be so flexible like that. But moving on, this is the last question I have for you, ma'am. What factors do you consider in choosing the materials that you used in language teaching?
Factors in choosing your materials in English language teaching, aside from, of course, the plan that you follow to make sure that you're on the right track with all the references included to it. I have to make sure that these materials are ideal to the levels of my learners. So it could be a little easy for those who are still young, a little harder for those who are in high school and college, and of course, it's quite expected for the graduate school to be really a bit challenging material. Depending on the course or the subject, I'll make sure that I find relevant materials and I try to update it as much as I can. And if I see something new or learn something new, I make sure I share it to the class. I always believe that there are some things that the teachers don't know. And with the generation of today, where students are really, really updated, you have to be abreast of what is really going on. As teachers, we have to update ourselves. So I always tell them to share something very relevant to the course. I also try to widen my network by attending a lot of trainings or seminars wherein I learn something new and eventually share what I've learned to my colleagues or my students. There are some suggested references in a syllabus. Now, as you go along with your lesson, you observe the things that you need to include, the things that you miss, the things that you probably want to change, and you can just do that because, after all, you're the teacher. So if I find reading material not really good for a course, I try to scrap it out and replace it with something quite fitting. I think I'm just talking about the general way how I do things. But above all, it's really the teacher who can really push the students to really love the course. Like, if the course is too difficult, but the teacher makes it appear easy and happy, I think there's no reason that the students won't love the course. I mean, that's just my take about it. So I'm not sure if I was able to answer all your questions. Basically, you can learn a lot of strategies. There are lots of good strategies out there, and on how to teach English. But there's no perfect strategy, to be honest. It all depends on what you are as a teacher and how you deal with all the challenges that you face in each class, because each student, by the way, is different from each other. So it has to do your perspective really on, and your love for teaching. For me, that's really what matters.
Thank you for sharing your wonderful experiences and giving us some tips, ma'am. I will personally take note on that so that I can apply it in the near future. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for inviting me today. Have a great day.
Dear listeners, I hope you gained something beneficial from Dr. Olano's talk with me. For now, I'll bid my goodbye. See you next podcast.